Welcome to another Hippocratic Adventures interview. I am Dr. Shwaniba Pat, and today we are so excited to have Dr. Justin Hensley with us. Justin is an emergency medicine physician. He went to medical school in Tennessee, did his surgery internship in South Carolina, EM residency in North Carolina, and then moved to Texas for 10 years before moving to Australia. He has interests in wilderness medicine as well as EMS, which we'll get to shortly. And before we get started, make sure to subscribe, sit back, and enjoy. Dr. Hensley, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. So tell us your story. How is it that you ended up in Australia?
Well, it's, obviously the last few years of medicine in the United States has been trying for a lot of us with the COVID pandemic. And we were looking at making a change. My wife's a pediatrician, I'm an emergency doctor. And we started looking at opportunities to practice medicine, first off, away from where we were, because there were a couple of Category 4 hurricanes that hit the coast of Texas where we lived nearby. And we knew that with climate change, the Gulf is going to keep warming up, cyclones are going to keep happening, and we were going to move from the coast. So we knew we had to move. And it was like, well, we're at a point in our lives where we're established, our kids are 8 and 12. Where can we move to that's going to be really beneficial to our children? And, we thought, okay, so New England or Hawaii or Alaska or something sort of quasi-exotic. But truthfully, those still had the problems of the American medical practice system with prior authorizations and insurance companies and uninsured patients getting sent into bankruptcy and patients without primary care, so they had no follow-up and all these other things. And so then we started kind of broadening our reach. I had previously worked in Fiji in 2015 for 3 months and met a whole bunch of Australians while I was there. I had worked in Mozambique in 2019. I worked in India in 2016. And so I'd done a bit of global emergency medicine teaching. And so I kind of put out some feelers to my friends to see where I could go. I'd spoken on the international emergency medicine kind of speaking circuit with some friends. And while I can speak passable medical Spanish in the setting, I still, I'm not comfortable doing without a translator. I certainly can't order food or anything very well in a Mexican restaurant because I can only name body parts and not food items. And so we kind of had to limit to countries with only English language. Neither of us were ever going to be able to teach ourselves and pass a exam in a foreign language, Italian or French or anything like that. And so we kind of put out some queries to our friends about working in Ireland and working in the UK. And I've got friends in South Africa and New Zealand and Australia. And the UK and Ireland have a couple of problems with regard to getting able to practice there as an American physician. Their accreditation bodies are a bit more black box in orientation, where you just send in your paperwork and a whole bunch of money, and 9 months later they decide to tell you how much supervision you're going to need and how much that's going to cost you. And it was kind of a real vague. And obviously, if you look at the news, the NHS has got its own problems and Ireland's got its own problems with regards to the practice of medicine. South Africa, while is a lovely place, does not help with the personal and local violence issues that we were trying to escape from as well. So it's not one little thing, but it was like, okay, so we're not going to move somewhere that's more dangerous. And so we didn't want to do that. New Zealand obviously was an option. And because the accreditation bodies for New Zealand and Australia are essentially the same, it's an Australasian college for both of us. She's a pediatrician, I'm an emergency doctor. It would have been easy to work in one and then go to the other, but New Zealand has a much lower pay rate than Australia. And while money isn't everything, if you decide to move overseas, you learn that money is a lot of that, and you will need to make up something. And so we decided to move to Australia, or at least look into moving to Australia. And then I applied for a job to work on the rescue helicopter. And when I got that, it's like, yeah, we're moving to Australia. We're not even going to bother applying to New Zealand or anything. It's like, if I get to work in a helicopter, I'm going to work in a helicopter. So that's how I got to here.
Wow. And so then so that's how you came to choose Australia, as you and your family kind of went through some of your criteria. So in making the transition to Australia, was the licensure process pretty straightforward, or did you have to take exams or anything like that?
So I did not have to take any new exams. I submitted all of my paperwork to the Australasian College of Emergency Medicine, and they do a proctored interview, which thankfully, because of COVID times, they've changed to doing it over Zoom. So you don't have to fly to Australia and sit in a boardroom and interview with them. You can do it digitally. And once they do the interview, they just go through your entire CV and your training, ask you a whole bunch of questions, and they decide whether you're substantially comparable or partially comparable or not comparable at all. If you're substantially comparable, or the Australian phrasing for effectively equivalent, they'll give you 3 or 6 or up to a year of supervised training, which you can do as a consultant or an attending. And they basically just want to make sure that you will get into the system and know how the drug names are different and how some of the flow is different, some of the specific tasks that doctors do here that they don't do in the States. And that really helps out. The minimum you're going to get from the emergency medicine side is 3 months, which is what I got. So I got 3 months of supervision, and I have to have 1 supervised intubation, strangely enough. Other people who haven't published sometimes have like a research requirement. So I've had some other friends do it, and they've had some research requirements that they've had to demonstrate. One I know that did an EM residency in the United States and has been out, they got a whole year. My NBN is apparently kicking out. I see my internet connection is unstable coming across my screen. Hopefully all that came through.
Yeah, so I think where we, just to recap, it sounds like for you, given your level of experience in research, you had to do 3 months of supervision, but some of your friends also in EM had to do about maybe a year of supervision with some component of research or scholarship as part of it. Okay.
But none of us who got substantially comparable had to do the exams. Okay. Whereas if you only completed part of your residency training and then wanted to switch over to Australia, then you'll have to do if you're not already board certified, they'll make you take the Australian boards, which are significantly harder than the American boards, from what I've gathered from my friends, just the way the questions are written.
Okay.
Because it's, almost all of ours are multiple choice, and there's a lot of short answer questions here where like you have to write out information. And it's just it's more of a British style of questions where if they ask for 4 things and you put 5 things and 4 of them are right, but you put one wrong one first, they only count the first 4, so the 5th one doesn't count. And it's a bit more of a tick box kind of thing, but it's just different than our way of test taking, which is why so many Americans have said it's quite difficult.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then that proctored interview, that was just what does that entail? That was just kind of review of your they go through, like, because if they just look at your CV, then they only see you on paper. And so they ask, specifically in my case, they asked about the research and like, so what part of this is, you're an author on this paper, what part of this research did you actually do? And can you explain this paper to us? Because we all know people that might have papers with their name on them that were only like in the same building when the paper was produced and not really. And so they want to make sure that if you are using a paper as a demonstration that you've done research, that you know that you've done the research and not done it. And because your CV is just all one-liners, they ask like, can you explain this to me? And on mine, it was really interesting because emergency doctors, we work a lot of places. And she was like, I don't understand how
in your CV, you've got a period of time of about 9 months, and you've got 5 different jobs all at the same time. And it's like, yeah, well, I worked like 2 shifts here and 3 shifts here, and like it's just how we do it in America. And they're like, none of them had any concept of that here. Like that's just not something people here do that regularly. Whereas in America, it's not that uncommon to have, as an emergency doc, a bunch of part-time jobs.
Great, got it.
So,
okay. So that's more kind of a detailed approach to looking
yeah.
at your CV, understanding what your experience is.
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. And so how did you said your first job was actually on a helicopter. How did you approach finding a job in Australia? Did you first go through the licensure registration process and then you looked for a job, or did you do that kind of in tandem?
So I sort of did it in tandem. I kind of went in an unusual order for most people, because I applied for the helicopter job first and got that interview and then got that job offer. And their start date was February of this year. And I wanted to move here a little sooner than that. And so then I started applying for other jobs at the same time as I was putting in all of my information into, we call it APRA, which is the Australian Healthcare Practitioner Regulatory Authority, AHPRA. And so they're the ones that you require to prove that you can work in Australia and get your provisional registration. So they're like the licensing body. The Australian Board of Medicine exists, but all of the paperwork and regulatory stuff goes through APRA. I'm not entirely sure what the Australian Board of Medicine does. They don't do a lot from what I gather, because I have not communicated with them a single time in all of this process, except for writing them a check at the very beginning and doing my registration with them, which is logging in and creating an account. But AHPRA does everything else. And at the same time you're doing AHPRA, you're also registering with your college, which for me was the College of Emergency Medicine. And that dictates where you'll go, because there's different registrations in Australia. One is general registration and one is specialty registration. And you can have both. There's not really a need to have both. And if you just apply to APRA without doing the college, you can only do general registration, because they won't consider you a specialist until the college in Australia says, yes, you are, or are comparable to a specialist, from what I've understood. The first year you're provisional anyway, so that part doesn't make as much of a difference. And honestly, I can't, as an outsider right now, can't tell any difference between a specialist registration and a general registration. They both let you do the same job. I've yet to figure out exactly what. I'm sure there's a difference that's more than just the amount you pay for it, but I haven't figured out what it is. It's like a who's who book or something, but yeah.
And then your proctored interview, that was actually with the Australian College of Emergency.
Correct.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Got it. And so what has it been like to work in Australia now? And what are some of the differences that you've noticed between the practice there and the practice you had in the US?
Well, now on the helicopter, it's significantly different, obviously. But in the emergency department, which I started working at first, there's minor differences. The names of drugs, they're very, very not in favor of using name brands of drugs. And so you'll have to remember all the generic names of all the drugs you've had as name brand. And some of them have different names, like Augmentin is Comox here. And there's some, it's not hard, but like some things you just have to think for a second to remember what it is. Even though they are very good with medicine and like moving forward care, documentation feels like the 1980s. Everything is on paper. you write drug charts. There's a drug chart and it's separate from a fluids chart. And if you want to put a drug in a fluid, it goes on the fluid chart. And so there's just multiple pieces of paper.
I don't think I've ever written a physical prescription on a piece of paper.
Yeah, it's completely different. They also, which is different from us, like in the emergency department in America, we'll write discharge instructions to patients.
Yeah.
But that's for the patient, to take these medicines, rest for this many days, whatever specific to their disease instructions. Here, they do that to a lesser degree. They do more verbal telling the patient, and it's not written down, so it's not as much of a medical legal concern. Like if you didn't give them the paper, then they'll never understand it. But you do write discharge summaries that go to their doctor.
Oh,
So you're basically writing discharge summaries to their GP.
got it.
For them to carry to their GP. Yeah. And the nice thing is, as an emergency doctor, almost all of our patients have general practitioners that they have follow-up with, because they're all on Medicare or have private insurance. And so they'll all go see somebody within the next few weeks, typically. They don't have to, but they can.
Yeah. Interesting. So you actually, as an emergency physician, will write a discharge summary, print it out, give it to them physically, and they bring that discharge summary to their general practitioner to let them know what happened.
I was in the hospital. I had these tests done. This is what was found. Yeah. And it's often written to like another doctor. And so the patient will probably look at it and read it.
Right.
And, they're like, what does this mean? And then you'll have to explain that to them as well. But yeah.
Okay.
So it's an interesting thing. Yeah.
And go ahead.
And then some other things. So because it's not the concern that you're going to be sued, you're not always having this fear in the back of your mind that every single thing you do has a risk of litigation. You don't do as much CYA testing. You don't concern yourself with the the 0.0001% chance of something that you'll have to rule out, because they have follow-up that they're going to see in the next week. And so you don't have to worry about missing this crazy little thing. Obviously, you can't practice terrible medicine. The board will get after you, APRA will get after you, or somebody will, but you don't have to worry as much about malpractice lawsuits. So it's nice because you can practice cost-effective, good, and efficient care, and not feel like you need to do tests just because somebody hit their head 7 days ago or something like that. Yeah. And so it's pretty interesting that way. But also on the flip side of that is, because we don't have to worry about that malpractice, we also don't have X-ray at night, and CT will often go away at night. You certainly aren't going to get any MRIs at night. So like you just get by with less stuff, or stuff just takes a little bit longer to do, and they do it as an outpatient. So you're not ordering RBC folate levels on patients or random like esoteric tests, because A, you can't, and B, you don't have to worry about doing that. So
that is a different practice for sure.
Yeah.
And it sounds like it actually makes you rely a little bit more on your physical exam skills, history taking skills. So that is very different. I always, when I think of any patient that comes to the ED, it doesn't matter what they have, they always get a CT head. And but I understand why, because in that situation in the US, you have to think about, like, let's just rule out all the zebras first. So
and we certainly have a lot more time to spend with patients. So in the EDs here, if you average more than one patient an hour, they think that you're flying through patients.
Wait,
like
what?
Yeah. Yes, in the ED. Like one patient an hour is the expected rate. Like if you on a regular shift, if you see like 10 to 12 patients, they're like, wow, you're a really fast doctor.
Wow.
Yeah. And it's the 10 or 12 hour shift, right? But part of that is because if they need a cannula or an IV, you're doing it. The nurses can, but they don't, it's not part of their routine. Like it's the doctor's job to do it. And you do it, and you collect the bloods, and you label the blood, and you send the blood to the lab, and it's all that's done by the physician.
Oh, wow.
And you're writing all the paperwork. Yeah.
Wow. Okay, I see. Okay.
Yeah. And sometimes, and because it's a completely different system than America, where if I want drug X, I go to the computer and I fire it up and I type it in there so that it's in the computer. Because if it's not a computerized physician order entry, it's not going to happen because verbal orders don't exist in America, in some places. You can go to the pharmacy, and as long as it's not a Schedule 4 or Schedule 8 drug, which are your narcotics, you get it and you give it to the patient yourself. Like if they need acetaminophen, Panadol here, paracetamol, you're getting it and giving it to the patient. You can ask the nurses to do it, and some things you can, like they'll do, but if you want it done quickly, the physicians will do a lot of things like that. We're drawing up our own sedatives for intubation. We're drawing up our own paralytics for sedation, for intubation, all of that. And so you spend a lot more time with the patient. The patient gets more direct care from the physician, which is good, and you don't feel like you're just being rushed to see the next patient. So I really do enjoy that.
And then, so if you are drawing up the labs, giving the medications, and what is the role of the nurse? Like, what is the role that the nurse has carved out?
They will give some of the medicines,
Okay.
but they do a significant number of like the auxiliary things. So if you want a catheter in the patient, they'll do the catheter. If they've got a laceration, you order for the wound to be cleansed, and they're cleaning the wound out and doing those things.
Okay.
They're making discussions with admitting to the floor, to the wards. Like they talk to the nurses on the floors for that, so you're not as involved in that step. You talk to the physician, but like the nurse communication. And they're still hanging fluid. So the doctors will start the fluid, but the nurses are titrating it, and they're charting their inputs and outputs. They're doing the other things. And like I said, the Schedule 4s and Schedule 8 drugs they have to get. But their role is less than what I'm used to in America, but they still do plenty of work.
Yes.
And they have a bit broader nurse to patient ratio. So especially here in New South Wales right now, where it's like we're in the nursing shortage, they're seeing up to one nurse for 8 patients and things like that. And so, I wonder which one is the cart and which is the horse, honestly, sometimes. Like, was it the doctors do all this because they started doing this, or because there weren't enough nurses to do it? And it's, I can't answer that question from my perspective yet, because I hadn't been here that long. But it seems like that was what they did in Fiji when I was there in 2015, and that's a very British system there too. And so it just seems like that's that kind of nurse, the Florence Nightingale nurses in hats and skirts thing. So they're ward sisters is what they get called, and it's just a different perspective. So
yeah, it sounds like there are different roles and even different expectations for what the physician do. Okay.
Yep.
And so what does your actually now I want to talk about, you are now a physician on a helicopter.
Yep.
Can you tell me about that? Have you worked on a helicopter before, or?
So I haven't worked on a helicopter. Well, I did some ride-alongs in residency.
Okay.
In North Carolina. And then I've done a bunch of EMS work in Texas when I lived there as medical director, but that's more kind of offline medical direction, writing the protocols and things. And sometimes I would ride along with the guys to see what I was doing, but I didn't often get hands-on in the patient care. Here in Australia, and especially the state of New South Wales where I am, New South Wales Ambulance has a retrieval service, and they call it medical retrieval. And it's essentially a medical team with a doctor and a critical care paramedic, which is a paramedic who's essentially a PA. Like, they've done multiple years of college, they have a bachelor's, and they've got post-baccalaureate training in paramedicine. Yeah. And so we get tasked to the critically unwell patients, major trauma accidents, certain types of cardiac arrests, drownings, and things like that, by either road ambulance or by helicopter. And so we have 3 helicopters in Sydney at any given time. There's a helicopter in Newcastle, one in multiple other cities. Before I just name all the cities in New South Wales we have helicopters in. And each of those has, obviously the pilot, the air crewman, and a paramedic and a doctor on that aircraft to go to the sickest of the sick. And a lot of that has to do with just kind of what we call the tyranny of distance here in Australia. So New South Wales is one of 7 states and territories in Australia. It is 25% bigger than the state of Texas,
Wow.
And it's not even one of the big states. Like
Oh,
Western Australia is more than 2 times the size of Alaska.
oh, wow. Okay.
So it's enormous. So if you started on the southern tip and drove for 20 hours, you still would not get out of Western Australia.
Oh my God.
Like it's that big. And so we do a lot of rotor wing and fixed wing. Like they'll fly airplanes. The Royal Flying Doctor Service flies airplanes. And so there's a significant need for retrieval doctors to be able to provide care to these places where there aren't physicians and the patients are unwell.
Mm.
We also sometimes do non-doc, like if it's just a patient that's really far away that doesn't need a doctor, they'll fly nurses out and do like community health for a day at some of these cattle stations and things. But for the most part, we are there for the sickest of the sick, both what are called primaries, which are the car wrecks and acute traumas, people who call 000, which is the equivalent of 911 in America here, and for the interfacility retrievals. So if there's a patient at hospital X that needs to go to hospital Y and they're in any way, shape, or form sick, either intubated or on some type of vasoactive drug that's titratable, or even sicker than that, we transfer people on ECMO, people with balloon pumps, all that stuff. And so that's our job, is basically a mobile ICU, for lack of a better word.
Yeah.
Um,
Wow.
and it's really fun because we also get to winch and like hang out of the cable of the aircraft and go into the mountains or pick people out of the ocean, things like that. So yeah.
But you've had experience in this before. This isn't, no, no, this is actually,
Not the helicopter side. Yeah, not the helicopter side. Yeah. Yeah.
wow.
So it was and that was a different interview process. So it was, obviously just as structured and patient care specific questions asked and all these other things. And so,
Wow.
yeah.
So was there like a learning curve that in adapting to kind of this kind of different clinical setting?
There is, it's very hard. The easiest way to, I guess, describe it to people who've never done it is, if you're on the plane and they ask if there's a doctor on the plane, like, and you're like, okay, so I'm in this aircraft and I have literally nothing that I would normally use to diagnose and treat a patient, right? Like, I hope they need oxygen and that's it, because that's all I've got, right? And so, yeah, they do a very structured and detailed induction training that's 3 weeks long that kind of goes through the motions. You're always tasked with a critical care paramedic who, has done 20 years of road work. And so they're very good at that kind of out of hospital setting. And it's, and they, like, you can get the job, and if you don't pass induction, you don't get to work on the helicopter. So they're like, it's not exactly boot camp, but it's stressful. There's a lot of hardcore thinking and stuff like that goes on.
Yeah.
Yes. So that's how they do that.
Wow. So it also sounds like you're developing an additional skill set that you're adding to your backpack of skills.
Yes.
That's
well. So the Australasian College does offer so anesthetics, ICU, and emergency medicine are the ones that are allowed to do this, as well as there's a separate college of rural and remote medicine, which is basically like GPs in the real far sticks that are also GP anesthetists or GP surgeons, that do a lot of stuff. And there's a diploma of pre-hospital and retrieval medicine. And so I'm actually in that training program now. I take the test next Friday, the written test for that. And so, yes, that's part of the allure of going to Australia. Like I said, work on the helicopter, getting a new training, getting a completely different experience from what we were doing. So.
Wow, that sounds very cool. That sounds just interesting to expand your skill set and your knowledge. That's awesome. And so now living in Australia, how do your income or benefits compare to that of a traditional EM position in the US?
So the vast majority of EM positions in America don't have benefits. They're all 1099 employment, essentially.
Okay.
And some of them aren't. So if you work for a residency training program, usually you'll be W-2 wages or salaried. Or if you work for Kaiser or some other ones, but most of them are run by one of the big contract management groups, your MCare/Envision, Schumacher Group. So that's a company that employs thousands of emergency doctors and also anesthetists and things like that. And so you're paid for the hours you work, and that's it. You don't get benefits. You get to pay double your Medicare or Social Security because they don't pay it. You don't get any 401k. Yeah, you can invest in your IRAs and things, but you don't like it's just a different style.
Yeah.
Here, you can work as essentially it's still locums, but what's called a VMO position, which is a visiting medical officer, and so you're not a staff specialist. And so it's similar. You get paid and they don't take taxes out of it and you get to keep track of it and pay your taxes at the end. But most jobs are staff positions. And so you get benefits. You are limited to 38 hours a week. 25% of that time is administrative time, which means no patient care. So you get 1/4 of your time to do your charting, your research, if you do research, all those things. You know, if you're on the P&T committee, you get to do, pharmaceuticals and therapeutics in the meetings with the office. It's not coming out of your paycheck because it's built-in admin time. And so they really strive to make that work-life balance a lot better. And if the Australian dollar and the American dollar were the same, my pay would be the same.
Yeah.
They aren't, but it's not a huge hit.
Yeah.
It's less, but it would be essentially for the amount of less stress that there is to work here, it's worth it. It'd be like, working 50% of my shifts in America would make a 50% pay cut. Well, here I work maybe 50% as hard as I would in America, but I'm making 75% of what I would earn in America. So I'm getting paid more for every unit hour I do. I just don't get paid as much as I was getting paid in the States. And apart from GPs, most specialists are kind of in that same boat. Obviously, if you're a neurosurgeon or something, you can make 7 figures pretty easily if you try hard enough. But yeah.
But it sounds like in terms of how hard you work and the wage that you get for it, it feels like a good amount that you and your family can subsist on. More than subsist on it, actually, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, there's certain things that we're gonna have to forego for a while. Vacations, we will. The good news is the trip to Fiji is a lot easier from Australia than it is from the States. It's a lot cheaper. The equivalent of when we lived in Texas, we would go to like Cancun or whatever fairly regularly because we enjoyed going to Mexico with the kids. Here, people go to Bali, so it's the same kind of thing. Yeah, because it's a lot cheaper from Australia. It's a lot closer, right? And there's things in Australia that are just so ridiculously beautiful, like the Whitsunday Islands and stuff. You don't even have to leave the country, and so there's a little bit less vacation. If you move to Sydney, which is only the 3rd most expensive city in the world to live in, I could make my paycheck go a lot further if I'd stayed in Western Australia and worked and lived in a much lower cost of living area, because I was actually getting paid more out there and everything cost less out there. But then you have the fact that it's essentially 5 hours from anything by airplane. And so it was, it's 2 hours to Perth and then 5 hours to anywhere else in Australia.
Okay.
So yeah, it's the Australia, the island is the size of the United States without Alaska hanging off the top. So the continental size is the same. And so it's just as big, but there's nothing in the middle essentially.
And what have you enjoyed most about your move to Australia?
So currently our favorite thing is that we have a mother and baby brush-tailed possum that come and visit us on the deck every night. And so like the crazy Australian marsupials, right? And so they look like tiny kangaroos, and they jump up on the deck and they walk around our deck and come hang out with us. My wife loves birds, and so the fact that cockatoos come and land on our deck, and we have lorikeets in the yard, it's really exciting. Just getting the kids to experience a new thing. They're in public school here just like they were in Texas, but it's shorter days and they don't feel as stressed. Like the teacher is on the same group of teachers that don't give homework, that the data doesn't support if you make the kid do all the learning at home, but they're just as good as they teach them at school. So they teach them at school, and then they come home and they don't have 2 hours of homework every night like they were having in the States. And so it just feels like it's a much better amount of family time. Like we are able to hang out with each other. We're able to go on walks all the time right now because I'm working fewer days per week and I'm not working as crazy as shifts as I was in America. So that was, the work-life balance is the biggest thing. It's been
Wow.
really nice.
And your kids adjusted okay because they were probably in elementary school, I imagine.
Yeah, so the oldest had just finished 6th grade,
Okay.
and he turns 13 in December, and the youngest turns 9 in November. And so they've adjusted really quite well. So here, grades K through 6 is primary school, and then 7 through 12 is secondary school. So they don't do a middle school separation. And the school year starts in February and ends in December. So they're only getting the last little bit of this year that they were able to do. It really they've plugged in real well because it's not terribly different from a ethnicity standpoint. It's not like they had to come and speak a whole new different language. It's not like they had a completely different culture and stuff like that. The really only difference is that they have to wear school uniforms, which they don't mind. So, it's pretty nice.
That's
It's
cool.
a very British thing. They all wear school uniforms.
Oh, that must be, I would think that would be so adorable.
Yeah, they is. And because it's Australia, they have to wear like wide brim hats. And so it's
Oh
just a whole bunch of little kids with wide brim hats. It's hysterical. Yeah.
That's adorable. Wonderful.
Yep.
Anything you wish you had known in advance of this transition?
So yeah, the easiest one is, if I wish that they out there somewhere in a clear and concise format, there was like a breakdown of like, this is roughly what it's going to cost to become a physician in this country and move your family over. Like that number just keeps creeping up, between the shipping containers and all the other stuff. Just so people have an idea. Like obviously, if it was, multiple, if it was more than 6 figures, that would be a deal breaker for almost everybody. And it's not 6 figures, but it's pretty high. Shipping costs is around $20,000 now because the shipping container issues with COVID and everything. Licensure was probably $10,000 between the college and APRA, and so it gets up there. And I wish honestly that I had known earlier how much easier it was for an emergency physician to come over, because I'm also now on the upper end of the age limit for permanent residency. So you can't get permanent residency in Australia if you're older than 45, unless you are in one of their special visa classes. If you get it before you're 45, you can still be one after you're 45, but you can't apply after the age of 45 for most things. If you're eligible for the global talent visa, you can do it until you're 150 for all they care. I'm not sure how many elderly global talents they have, but there's no age limit on that one. So but it's knowing some of those things, it certainly isn't something you want to push off until you're like in semi-retirement, because a lot of countries have age limits for permanent residency. And I can keep working here forever without being a permanent resident. I can keep getting new temporary visas. It's just that's another cost issue. The visas a few $1,000s. My kids' public schooling is a few $1,000s, and if I get permanent residency, all those costs go away every couple of years, which really helps. So yeah.
All right, so now we're going to switch over to what I call rapid fire questions, just questions where you answer with one word or one sentence, nothing more than short off the top of your head. So what's a cool place that you visited after moving to Australia?
Cool place. Hobart.
Hobart, what is it?
Hobart is a city in Tasmania.
Okay.
And so it's an island very far south that's separate from the mainland. And it's essentially like visiting Scotland. It's cold, it's mountainy, it's very interesting. It's where they send ships to Antarctica. So it's just a really neat place.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool. What is a piece of advice you'd give to someone who is on the fence about moving to Australia? Maybe it's another
Do it.
doctor.
Just do it.
Just do it.
Yep. Everything you ever wanted is on the other side of fear.
Interesting.
So it's I would rather remember when than wonder what if. And yeah, it's expensive, but if you come over for 2 years and you don't like it, you're still an American resident. You can still go back. Like, you don't have to move all your stuff over. You can keep your stuff in the storage for a while, but it's worth it when you realize how much better life is in comparison to work. There are negatives. My family is 9+ hours on either end of when I'm trying to talk to them, and it's a long flight if somebody over there needs me to come visit. But I don't know. It's just do it. Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah.
And, last question, which you kind of actually answered, was, has this relocation and move been worth it for you?
Absolutely. 100%.
Yeah.
I just wish I'd done it a little earlier, like maybe before COVID, but that is the other one piece of advice I would always recommend. If there's a worldwide pandemic going on, don't try to move to another country during that. It becomes very difficult. Yes. But it's still doable. It's just a lot harder. You can spend a lot of time in quarantine.
That makes sense. Well, Dr. Justin Hensley, thank you so much for joining us. For those who are interested in moving to Australia but feel overwhelmed with the relocation process and you want to find a way forward, sign up for our guidance service. We have partnered with Dr. Carmen Brown of Expat MD, who provides personalized guidance to fellow physicians looking to move to Australia. You can sign up at hippocraticadventures.com/guidance. And with that, we wrap up another episode of Discovering Where Your White Coat Can Take You. Don't forget to subscribe, like, or post a comment. And of course, if you found this helpful, share this with your friends and colleagues. For those who are interested in moving to Australia but feel overwhelmed with the relocation process and you want to find a way forward, sign up for our guidance service. We have partnered with Dr. Carmen Brown of Expat MD, who provides personalized guidance to fellow physicians looking to move to Australia. You can sign up at hippocraticadventures.com/guidance. And with that, we wrap up another episode of Discovering Where Your White Coat Can Take You. Don't forget to subscribe, like, or post a comment. And if you like this, share this with your colleagues and friends.